It had started like any ordinary Tuesday morning. The Charleston Federal Courthouse stood tall against the pale blue sky, its marble columns glowing in the early sunlight. People filtered through the heavy brass doors, clutching folders, checking watches, mentally preparing for whatever awaited them inside. But for one woman, that day became anything but ordinary. A day that began with humiliation, ended with history being made within those very walls. Because when a black woman stepped into power after being stripped of her dignity, justice didn't just get served, it got redefined. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Judge Charlotte Marsh parked her modest sedan in the public lot 2 blocks from the courthouse. She had been on the federal bench for 8 years, but she had never used the reserved parking spaces. "I walk in like everyone else," she often told her clerk. "It keeps me grounded." That day she wore a tailored navy pantsuit, her silver-streaked locks twisted elegantly around her crown. No judicial robe, no badge of office, just another citizen entering the halls of justice, or so it appeared. The morning air carried a hint of jasmine as she climbed the courthouse steps. Charlotte adjusted her leather portfolio under her arm, mentally reviewing the high-profile police misconduct case on her docket that day. 6 officers were facing charges after a protest turned violent the previous year. National attention, heavy press coverage, the kind of case that defined careers and changed communities. She entered through the public entrance, just as she always had. The security checkpoint was backed up. 3 lines of visitors, attorneys, and witnesses waiting to pass through metal detectors. Charlotte joined the shortest line, patient and observant. That was when Officer Donald Perez noticed her. He had been a courthouse security officer for 14 years, known for his rigid demeanor and quick temper. Some called him a stickler for procedure. Others knew him as something far more dangerous, a man who wielded his badge like a weapon, particularly against those who didn't fit his image of authority. His eyes narrowed as Charlotte approached the front of the line. He stepped forward, blocking her path. "Ma'am, step aside, please." Charlotte paused. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Random security check," he replied, eyes scanning her from head to toe. "Follow me." "I'm actually due in court." "That wasn't a request," he interrupted, his voice hardening. "Or would you prefer I call for backup?" The threat hung in the air. Around them, people pretended not to notice, eyes averted. A young security trainee shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Charlotte met Perez's gaze, calm, measured. She reached into her jacket and produced her federal credentials. "I believe this should clear things up." Perez barely glanced at the ID before pocketing it. "Nice try, still need you to come with me, now." His hand clamped around her upper arm, fingers digging into her skin through the fabric of her suit. He steered her past the main security area, down a narrow hallway, and into a small, windowless room used for enhanced screenings. The door closed with a heavy click. Inside, a steel chair sat beneath harsh fluorescent lights. A table held various security equipment, and at the edge, a pair of electric clippers. "Sit," Perez commanded. Charlotte remained standing. "Officer, I need my credentials returned immediately. This detention is unwarranted and illegal." "Illegal?" He laughed. "Lady, I am the law in this checkpoint, and right now you're acting suspicious." "Suspicious how? By entering a public courthouse while black?" His face hardened. "Watch your mouth. That attitude is exactly what I'm talking about." He reached for his radio. Within moments, 2 additional officers entered, Wayne Harold and Randy Mason. They flanked Charlotte while Perez picked up the clippers. "What are you doing?" Charlotte asked, alarm rising in her voice. Standard protocol for suspicious individuals could be hiding anything in that hair. Charlotte's heart pounded. "This is not protocol, this is assault. Call it whatever you want. Sit down, or they'll make you sit down." The choice was made for her as the 2 officers forced her into the chair. Their grip was tight enough to bruise. Charlotte didn't fight physically. She knew better. Instead, she memorized faces, names on badges, every detail of that room. The clippers buzzed to life with a mechanical whine. "This will teach you some respect," Perez muttered, bringing the blades to her scalp. Charlotte didn't scream, didn't beg. She sat perfectly still as the silver coils of her hair, locks she had grown for years, that connected her to her mother, her grandmother, her heritage, fell to the floor in clumps around her feet. "Look at that," Mason snickered. "She's actually prettier now." Perez continued shaving uneven patches across her scalp, deliberately leaving some areas longer than others. A calculated humiliation. When he finished, he stepped back to admire his work. "Now you look presentable for court," he said with a smirk. "Whatever business you have there." Charlotte rose slowly from the chair. Her scalp burned. Her dignity lay around her feet with the severed locks of her hair. But her eyes remained cold and clear, focused on Perez's badge number, memorizing it. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. Perez laughed again. "People like you always say that. Now get moving. I've got real business to attend to." He tossed her credentials onto the table and gestured toward the door. "Courtroom's that away. If that's really where you're headed." Charlotte retrieved her ID without a word. She straightened her jacket, picked up her portfolio from where it had been tossed aside, and walked out with her head high as she moved through the corridors. People stared. Some whispered. A clerk gasped softly and quickly looked away. No one offered help. No one spoke up. They just watched as a black woman with a partially shaved head walked steadily toward courtroom 4A. Inside, the gallery was packed. Journalists lined the back row. Families of victims sat tight-lipped in the front. Defense attorneys clustered around their clients. 6 officers in dress uniforms, polished and pristine. Charlotte walked straight down the center aisle. The room gradually fell silent as heads turned to follow her progress. Confusion spread across faces. The court clerk rose halfway from her seat, then froze. Without a word, Charlotte walked through the small gate separating the gallery from the court proceedings. She moved past the prosecution table, past the defense, directly to the judge's bench. She stepped behind it and turned to face the room. Recognition dawned slowly, then all at once. This woman, this black woman with her hair savagely cut with patches of scalp exposed, was not a witness, not a victim, not a confused civilian. She was the Honorable Judge Charlotte Marsh of the United States District Court. Officer Perez stood frozen by the courtroom door, his face draining of color as he realized what he had done, who he had assaulted, the power he had just challenged. Charlotte reached for her judicial robe folded neatly over her chair. She slipped it on deliberately, each movement precise and measured. The black fabric settled over her shoulders like armor. "Court is now in session," she said, voice clear and unwavering. The room rose in stunned silence. She did not acknowledge Perez, not yet. Instead, she sat and nodded to the court clerk. "Call the first case." The clerk's voice wavered. "United States versus Officer Jacqueline James et al. Charges of excessive force and civil rights violations." Charlotte looked out over the courtroom, her gaze passing briefly over Perez, who seemed unable to move from his position by the door. "Counsel, are you prepared to begin?" The federal prosecutor stood, clearly struggling to maintain composure. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then proceed." And just like that, with no mention of what had transpired, with no outward acknowledgement of the assault she had just endured, Judge Charlotte Marsh began the proceedings. But every person in that courtroom knew something had shifted. Every person understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Because power wasn't just about wearing a robe or sitting on a bench. Real power was what happened when you refused to let them break you. As Charlotte listened to the opening arguments, the clippers still echoed in her ears. She could feel the cold air on her exposed scalp, the lingering touch of hostile hands on her arms, but none of it showed on her face. She took meticulous notes, asked precise questions, maintained absolute control of her courtroom. Officer Perez remained by the door, visibly struggling to compose himself. His eyes darted to the exit repeatedly, but he was trapped by duty and protocol. He couldn't leave his post without relief, and now he was forced to stand guard for the very judge he had humiliated. The morning testimony unfolded with methodical precision. A young protester described being struck repeatedly with batons, despite having his hands raised in surrender. A medical examiner confirmed that the injuries were consistent with excessive force. Defense attorneys objected frequently, trying to establish that the protest had turned violent before police intervention. Through it all, Charlotte presided with unwavering focus. But beneath her calm exterior, wheels were turning. Between witness testimonies, she wrote a brief note and passed it discreetly to her clerk. After 2 hours of testimony, she called for a recess. "Court will reconvene in 30 minutes, she announced, rising from the bench. As the gallery began to clear, she added, "Officer Perez, please remain." The room went still. Those who were halfway to the door paused, sensing something significant about to unfold. Perez stepped forward, his face rigid with apprehension. "Your Honor?" His voice barely carried across the now silent courtroom. Charlotte waited until only essential court personnel remained in the room. Then she stepped down from the bench, removing her robe as she approached him. Without the barrier of the bench between them, the contrast was stark. Charlotte, a petite woman with her hair brutally shorn, facing the uniformed officer who stood half a head taller. "Officer Donald Perez," she said, voice perfectly controlled. "You are being relieved of duty, effective immediately." He struggled to find words. "Your Honor, I couldn't have known that I was a federal judge," she finished for him. "And that makes your actions acceptable? If I had been a defendant, a witness, a family member, would that have justified assault?" "It was standard protocol for—" "Do not," she cut him off, "insult this court by lying. There is no protocol that authorizes you to forcibly shave a civilian's head during a security screening." At that moment, 2 U.S. Marshals entered the courtroom. Charlotte had summoned them during her note to the clerk. "Officer Perez, you are being detained on charges of assault against a federal judge, civil rights violations, and abuse of power under color of authority." One of the marshals stepped forward with handcuffs. "This is outrageous," Perez sputtered. "You can't." "I can," Charlotte stated firmly, "and I am. You will be processed like any other defendant facing federal charges. You will be afforded every legal protection that our system provides, the same system you violated this morning." As the marshals led him away, Charlotte turned to the remaining court staff, who stood in stunned silence. "Court resumes in 20 minutes, and I'll need the security footage from Checkpoint 3 and the screening room preserved immediately." She walked back to her chambers, closing the door behind her. Only then, in the privacy of her office, did she allow herself a single deep breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched her scalp, feeling the uneven patches where her hair had once grown. A knock on the door interrupted her moment of vulnerability. "Come in." Her clerk entered, eyes wide. "Judge Marsh, word is spreading about what happened. There are reporters gathering outside, and—" She hesitated. "The chief judge is asking to speak with you." Charlotte nodded. "Tell him I'll call after today's session. And Karen?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Thank you for your composure out there. It matters." Karen nodded, blinking back tears. "What he did to you, it's unforgivable." "It's not about forgiveness," Charlotte replied. "It's about accountability." When court reconvened, the energy in the room had transformed. News had spread like wildfire. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls. Every eye watched as Charlotte took the bench again, her partially shaved head now a symbol of something powerful and unbroken. "Before we continue with testimony," she announced, "I want to address what has occurred today." The room fell completely silent. "This morning, I was assaulted by a court security officer who has since been taken into custody. I mention this not to derail our proceedings, but because justice cannot function in shadows. What happened to me happens to countless individuals who enter courthouses across this country, people who are profiled, humiliated, and assaulted simply because of how they look." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "The case before us today involves officers accused of using excessive force against citizens exercising their constitutional rights. The irony that I experienced a similar abuse of power within these very walls is not lost on me, but it will not deter me from presiding fairly over these proceedings." The defense table stirred uncomfortably. "Now, let us continue with the testimony of Howard Montgomery." A black man in his 40s rose from the gallery. As he made his way to the witness stand, several people noticed something they hadn't before. A scar trailing from his temple to his jaw, still pink and healing. Howard was sworn in. He sat tall, hands folded in his lap, eyes occasionally drifting to Judge Marsh's shaved head with quiet recognition. "Mr. Montgomery," the prosecutor began, "could you tell the court why you were at the peaceful protest on May 14th last year?" I was there with my son, Elijah. He's 17. It was his first protest. We went because he wanted to stand up for something he believed in, and I wanted to be there with him, to keep him safe. His voice caught on the last word. And what happened that day? Howard's eyes hardened. We were standing well behind the front line, holding signs, chanting, nothing more. When the police charged, we tried to move back, but there was nowhere to go. An officer, he pointed to one of the defendants. That one right there, tackled my son. Knelt on his neck, even though Elijah kept saying he couldn't breathe. The courtroom absorbed this with tense silence. I begged them to let him up. I said, he's just a kid. That's when another officer hit me with his baton. Here. Howard touched the scar on his face. I was bleeding everywhere, but all I cared about was Elijah. He was turning blue. What happened next? A woman, a nurse who was also protesting, pushed through and started screaming about his oxygen. They finally let him up. Paramedics came eventually, but he still has trouble breathing sometimes. Has nightmares. Loud noises make him jump. Charlotte listened intently, taking careful notes. Did you file a formal complaint about this incident? Howard nodded. The next day, I went to the precinct myself, filed paperwork. They told me they'd investigate. 2 weeks later, I got a letter saying the officers acted within protocol and no further action was warranted. And were you offered any explanation for this conclusion? They said my story didn't match the police report, that Elijah had been combative, and I had interfered with an arrest. Neither was true, but their word against ours, right? As testimony continued, more witnesses came forward. A college student whose arm was broken. A grandmother was pepper-sprayed while trying to help a fallen protester. A journalist whose camera was smashed when he tried to film the violence. Each story built upon the last, creating a pattern not of isolated incidents, but of systematic abuse. Throughout it all, Charlotte presided with unwavering attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never revealing bias. During the afternoon recess, Charlotte returned to her chambers to find a visitor waiting. Liam Walter, the courthouse records supervisor. A nervous man in his 50s who had worked in the system for decades. Your Honor, he said, fidgeting with a thick folder in his hands. There's something you should see. He placed the folder on her desk. Inside were complaint forms, dozens of them, filed against Officer Perez over the past decade. Sexual harassment, racial profiling, excessive force, all dismissed, all buried. He's been doing this for years, Walter admitted, shame evident in his voice, targeting people of color, women especially. I processed these reports myself. And they were all dismissed? Charlotte asked, flipping through the pages. Walter nodded. By order of Judge Mason, he said Perez was effective at maintaining security, that the complaints were likely exaggerated. Judge Randy Mason, Charlotte's predecessor, her mentor, the man who had championed her appointment to the bench. Why bring this to me now? She asked, studying Walter's face. Because what he did to you, his voice broke. I can't be silent anymore. There are others too. Other officers, other judges who look the other way. The whole system. Charlotte closed the folder. Thank you, Mr. Walter. I'll need your formal testimony. They'll come after me. Yes, she acknowledged. They will, but not alone. Not anymore. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Word had spread about Officer Perez's arrest, about Judge Marsh's refusal to recuse herself or cover up what had happened, about her continued poise in the face of humiliation. As testimony resumed, Charlotte noticed new faces in the gallery. Other courthouse employees, security officers from different checkpoints, people who had previously been invisible to her, now watching with a mix of fear and hope. During cross-examination of a police lieutenant, the defense attorney rose with a calculated look in his eye. Your Honor, given the events of this morning, we must formally request that you recuse yourself from this case. The room tensed. On what grounds, Counselor? Charlotte asked evenly. With all due respect, the incident with Officer Perez has created an appearance of bias. You cannot be expected to impartially judge officers accused of misconduct when you yourself have just been assaulted by an officer, she finished for him. Is that your argument? That experiencing police misconduct firsthand makes one incapable of upholding justice in cases involving police misconduct? The attorney shifted uncomfortably. We believe the appearance of impartiality is essential to "Let me be very clear," Charlotte interrupted, her voice steady but firm. "What happened this morning was recorded on security cameras. It was witnessed by multiple court employees. It was an objectively illegal act. My experience as a victim does not compromise my ability to assess evidence and apply the law." She leaned forward slightly. "In fact, one might argue that it brings a necessary perspective to this bench. A perspective that has been systematically excluded from our justice system for generations." The defense attorney opened his mouth to object, but Charlotte continued. "Your motion is denied. This court will continue to evaluate the evidence presented fairly and without bias. But make no mistake, I will not recuse myself to perpetuate the fiction that justice can only be administered by those who have never experienced injustice." A ripple moved through the gallery. Not applause, which would be inappropriate in court, but a collective shift. A release of held breath. Something fundamental had just changed in that room. As the day progressed, more witnesses came forward. Not just those scheduled to testify in the police misconduct case, but others. Court employees began approaching the bench during breaks. A security trainee described how Perez taught officers to target certain types for enhanced screening. A clerk admitted to misfiling complaints against courthouse officers. A paralegal recounted witnessing similar head-shaving incidents, always targeting women of color, always justified as protocol. This wasn't just a story about a judge or a courthouse or a moment of injustice answered with courage. It was a reminder that systems didn't change until someone forced them to face their contradictions. That dignity wasn't given. It was claimed, again and again, by those who understood its worth. By late afternoon, what had started as a trial of 6 officers had transformed into an indictment of the entire courthouse. Judge Charlotte Marsh called a final witness, Judge Randy Mason. His confidence faltered when he saw Charlotte's shaved head and unwavering stare. "Judge Mason," she began, "were you aware of complaints filed against Officer Donald Perez during your tenure?" "There were grievances," he said, 12 and 10 years, all dismissed by you," she replied. When confronted with the 2019 case of Maria Diaz, Mason claimed the footage was inconclusive. "It showed exactly what happened to me this morning," Charlotte said. "You valued control over justice." She closed the folder. No further questions. Turning to the court, "I'm issuing a judicial order to review every misconduct complaint from the last decade and requesting a DOJ investigation into systemic abuse of power. Justice cannot hide, not in my courtroom." That night, her sister Nadine arrived with clippers. Charlotte let her finish the shave on her terms. Her bald head now symbolized strength. The next morning, she walked up the courthouse steps bareheaded. No wig, no shame. The gallery rose for her before the bailiff could speak. "Yesterday, this court endured injustice. Today we pursue truth," she declared. Testimony continued, bold and unflinching. By afternoon, 2 officers requested plea deals. Charlotte set one condition: reforms, real oversight, civilian review. The Marsh Mandate was born. In accepting the settlement, she said, "This is a beginning. Justice is a path, not a destination." Weeks later, her story had gone national. Other complaints surfaced. The DOJ expanded its probe. Judge Mason resigned. One morning, she found a group of women with shaved heads waiting for her at the courthouse steps. They parted silently to let her pass. 6 months later, she addressed a judicial conference. "Blind justice means nothing if we ignore whose pain we refuse to see." 1 year after the assault, the security trainee returned, now a law student. "I want to be better," she said. Charlotte smiled. "Then sit. Let's talk about what justice really means." The building around them had changed. New protocols, oversight, transparency. Justice no longer felt distant because one judge refused to break. She transformed the bench and the system around it. So if this story moved you, if it made you question where you stood when power abused its authority, share it. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.